That was fantastic. Let me thank Aaron and Joe, my co-presenters. Thank all of you for being here. My name's Glenn Harris. I'm president at the Center for Social Inclusion. We are based out of New York, but I live in Brooklyn, as was mentioned earlier. But I'm gonna stick to the theme. I'm gonna talk a little bit about government and equity and race. So I have been at the Center for Social Inclusion for 2 years. We do work with community and institutions like government, really looking at how do we center race and equity. But I'm also a recovering bureaucrat. I've been at the Center for Social Inclusion for 2 years, and prior to coming to CSI, I spent 15 years working in the city of Seattle. And I managed the city's race. I've got the Race and Social Justice Initiative. That's it, Seattle. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of building off our comments today. I don't believe that we can get to good government unless we actually get to racial equity. I believe that's the great unfinished business of our country. And so why, and I can tell this thing's gonna keep jumping, so bear with me, I'm gonna have to jump back and forth with it. So why race? You all know this. It doesn't matter what indicator we look at, right? It doesn't matter if we talk about housing, education, you pick it. Race is the leading indicator or a leading indicator in outcome in 2016. And it's not just about policing, right? Ferguson, powerful moment, we all know it. The Ferguson report, great piece on really thinking about strategies for how we can get to better government around race. But the most powerful piece in the Ferguson report for me wasn't around policing, it was the number 30 years. That's the difference in life expectancy in Ferguson based on zip code. 30 years, full lifetime, right? And that's not just about policing, that is about all of those elements sort of coming together. So, why equity? Got to define our terms, so do this with me really quick. Everybody here's been to a sporting event or a show, and the halftime comes or an intermission comes, and we all file out and we go to the restrooms. What's the difference in experience in that for men versus women? Lines. Women in the room, what's the difference? Lines. How much longer do you think you wait on average than men? A lot. How much? 10 times, right? It is significant. How many bathrooms in those facilities for men versus women? They are the same. That is equality, right? Half of us are men, half of us are women, therefore half our restrooms are for men, half our restrooms for women. But for a whole series of reasons about everything from who designed restrooms to how people use restrooms, the outcome is radically different. It's inequitable. And so when we talk about equity, we're really just talking about bringing a little bit of common sense and a little bit of justice to a situation that's out of balance, right? So over the last decade, we've seen a lot of work around this. So, you know, you've got architects saying we're gonna bring 2 women's restrooms for every 1 men's restroom, right? Just a simple fix. But in the last year, we've talked a lot about bathrooms, right? Right? That's right. So what about gender neutral restrooms? What about taking it to something a little more transformative? What about thinking of yet another way to address not racial segregation, but spatial segregation, right? So again, it's really about just applying a little bit of common sense, a little bit of justice to a system that's out of balance. But the real reason that I like this example is for the men in the room, what are we doing while women are waiting in lines? Besides being silent? What are we doing? What are we really doing? We're standing outside waiting. Because when a system's out of balance, it's not working for anybody. It's just some of us are paying a higher cost for it, right? So men are waiting on their daughters, their friends, their sisters, their partners. They're waiting. If women get through restrooms quicker, guess what? Men get through those systems quicker. That's equity. It's not just about getting to benefits for those who are most impacted. It's recognizing when we do, we come up with systems that work better for everyone. Right? So why government? Touched on this. Because government created racial inequity. Just that simple. It doesn't matter if we're talking about who could be a citizen. Doesn't matter if we're talking about where you could live. Doesn't matter if we're talking about who could own property. It doesn't matter if we're talking about who was property. Those were all government policy decisions set up over hundreds of years to get us to the communities that we see today, right? Ghettos are not natural. They were built purposely. So what we know is that's our history. And then the middle of the last century, we saw folks say enough. And we had the most significant civil rights legislation passed in our country's history, and we got closer to the ideal that our founding fathers were talking about 400 years ago, or 250 years ago, I should say. But the truth is, what we really did at the same time is we moved into this period of race-neutral policy. So we said, oh yeah, that was bad, but what we should do is just not talk about it. We should stop doing it and stop talking about it. And so what it really allowed was for those systems to continue to perpetuate the exact same outcomes, only this time we're not naming race. And so our argument's a simple one, that the only way we're getting out of this is if we center race and we name it. Why the urgency? Because by 2040, the people who those disparities represent will be the majority of us. If we do not address these issues, our communities, quite honestly, will simply fail. It's not tenable. It is not economically tenable. It is not socially tenable. So do this with me. Think of a number between 1 and 10. Don't tell anybody. Got your number? Okay. Multiply that number times 9 and take your time. I'm telling you, take your time. I got this wrong the first time I did it. Got your number? So if it's a 2-digit number that you ended up with, add them together. You want to come back to a single digit. So if it was 32, it'd be 3 plus 2 equals 5. Got it? Subtract 5 from that number. Got your number? Convert that into a letter. So 1 would be A, 2 would be B. You with me? Got your letter? Think of a country that starts with that letter. Got it? Last letter in your country's name. The last letter in your country's name. Think of an animal that starts with that letter. Got it? Last letter in your animal's name. Think of a fruit that starts with that letter. It's the last one. Got it? Okay, raise your hand if you're thinking about kangaroos in Denmark eating oranges. Raise your hand if that's what you got. Right? Raise them high, so everybody can see. How'd that work? Help me. How does that work? What's the magic? 9, math. Trust me, the math was a distraction, right? Like so much in our daily lives. Just there to keep us from seeing what's really happening, right? The real question was a really simple one, which was, if you got your math right, if you didn't, you got your math right, there's only one question. What country starts with the letter D? There we go, we got Dominica. Yeah, yes, I will give it to you even though it's not officially recognized by the UN. I'm sorry, I've Googled these things. It turns out there's 4 formal countries recognized, but before doing that, hold this with me, 70-90% of people in the United States to this set of questions say Denmark, kangaroo, orange. Right? So a little bit of bias going on. 4 countries start with the letter D, formally, and we'll give Democratic, I'm with you. But it's Denmark, Dominica, Dominican Republic, and my personal favorite, Djibouti in Central Northern Africa, right? So we got 4 countries. We know there's a little bit of bias, but hold this with me. How many animals start with the letter K? Anybody else get anything besides kangaroo? Koala. Turns out if you Google this, there are dozens. Kingfish, kiwi. You with me? How many fruits start with the letter O? Olive. Oh, you are a smart man. I didn't know olive was a fruit. You with me? Had to Google that to find that out. So, turns out 70 and 90% of us say Denmark kangaroo orange to a set of questions in which there's over 1 million possibilities. Over 1 million answers, and 70 and 90% of us say Denmark kangaroo orange. Why? Because even when we think we're starting with our own ideas, there's a whole set of history, culture, institutional policy, practice, and structure that drives all of us endlessly to the same outcome, again and again and again. So when we look around and we're like, how can we have racial disparities that are the same or worse than 1964? Denmark kangaroo orange. You with me? Right? Tomorrow, I promise you, somebody in this room is going to get up and say, I have a brand new idea to getting to equity, Denmark kangaroo orange. So the question is, how do we interrupt that? How do we change that? And one of the things we know is that there's a lot of different ways for us to think about how we get to change. But what we've come to center is we've got to change government, right? Government has to come back to its formal duty of thinking about what equity looks like in our communities, because without it, there is no such thing as democracy. So what we've been doing is we've got an alliance, a government alliance on race and equity, and we're working right now with over 100 jurisdictions from across the country, about 50 of them formally, and 20 of them as formal members, to build a national network of folks looking at not only how do we talk about race, but how do we bring that into policy, and more importantly, how do we transform our institutions to fundamentally center that work as what it means to do government work. So very quickly, this is our format. We talk about normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing. We have to normalize conversations around race if we want to get to the possibility of different outcomes. We have to organize both with community and partners and government, but also government has to organize internally. Government is not just elected officials. And help us if it really was only that. 1 in 6 people in the United States are government employees or paid by government dollars. Government is the single largest employee for people of color in living wage jobs. We are government, and it is time we own it. Operationalize, that's all great, but we've got to figure out how we actually put that into action. And so that's use of tools, bringing a racial equity lens, and what does it mean for us to measure? One of my favorite surveys asked folks, are you comfortable in talking about race? This is this whole conversation about what does it mean for us to normalize conversation about race. And 90% of people said, yep, I'm all good. And the follow-up question was, do you believe your neighbor's comfortable in talking about race? And 90% of people said, no, not them, right? It is the reality of where we're at, and the only way we're moving forward is to change this dynamic. It turns out that operationalizing equity is a really tricky thing, right? And so really, as we name that, all we're really getting at is making it real. And it's the use of racial equity tools, bringing a lens to actually thinking about how we're making policy decisions or practice decisions. And those tools have been used in many ways around the country, but I'm going to focus on Seattle because I know Seattle. So in Seattle, a racial equity lens is now brought to all budget decisions in the city on an annual basis, right? We don't get to make a budget change without asking what are the race and social justice impacts and are there any unintended consequences. But in addition to that, it's literally been used to change hundreds of policies, including restrictions on use of criminal background checks. We actually stopped prosecuting people who were driving with license suspended, because what we really were doing was putting brown and black folks in prison for being poor. We have over a 300% increase in thinking about contracting dollars for women and minority-owned businesses, right? And we even brought it to the review and implementation of $15 minimum wage. All of that is fantastic, but the piece that I'm actually most excited about in the potential of this work is what happens with those kinds of conversations over time. And over time, what's happened in Seattle is it's moved from just being policy discussions to structural conversations. And so when we're talking about use of a tool, all we're naming is it's both a process and a product. It's both a process and an outcome. That's the only way we can think about equity, right? And what that, there it is, has led to is, in many ways, a lot of different structural changes. Turns out the government's actually not set up to build the kind of communities we all want to have. It wasn't even designed to do that in that way. And so in Seattle, over time, what that's looked like is the creation of community, can't even get it out, an equitable development initiative that eventually actually became a formal office just this last year. There's also an environment and equity initiative. So really thinking about how government is arranged, not just what it's doing. So in wrapping up, all good, but this is also about how do people change. This is from a survey of government employees. And in Seattle, 5,000 employees responded to this survey. This is from 2012. 86% of those responding said, I believe it's critical we examine the impact of race at work. 2/3, over 3,500 people said, I'm actively trying to figure out what that looks like in my job, in my daily work. And 60% believe we're actually making progress in doing that. We've got to figure out how these things become not just one-off conversations, but again, formally the way we do business. Because when we find solutions that work for those who are most vulnerable in our communities, we always find solutions that work better for all of us. Thank you. Appreciate your time.